and like following along with the reading, please turn to 2 Kings chapter 6. This is where we're going to spend our time.
Could you say that one more time?
2 Kings chapter 6. And I've got a little preamble here, which is not normally what I do. Normally I'll read the text first, but I'm not going to do that today because I want to set us into a grid of thinking as we go forward in this talk today. There are some words we use, and two of them specifically that I think we don't really use correctly most of the time. And the two words are courage and fearlessness. I don't think we really understand as we use these words what they really entail. A couple of weeks ago we looked at King Hezekiah as he was facing the Assyrians in a siege. And Hezekiah, then you remember, spread that letter out in front of God, which I just thought, to me, was the most amazingly childlike, faithful thing to do. I mean, imagine this guy. He's the king of Israel. He's not just he's not a teenager. He's the king. And he spreads that letter out in front of God. That says so much about him. And we admire that, right? I do. Tremendous admiration for that. Well, that's not the way it is in our culture today at all. Think for a moment. We have a Speaker of the House right now who proclaims himself to be an evangelical believer and openly a believer. In fact, he has stated that he prays about the decisions that he's going to make. Okay, that's not admired at all in our culture. As a matter of fact, if you read some of the commentary about our present Speaker of the House, he's seen as somebody to be feared in some ways, that he's unstable, that there's something wrong with him because he's going to pray about his decisions. He's weak, he's imbalanced. All of these kinds of descriptions. There's a subtlety to courage, and courage is not fearlessness. It is not. As a matter of fact, a truly fearless person is defective. Psychopaths are truly fearless. They fear nothing. A schizophrenic will be truly fearless. Fear is part of who we are as human beings. It just is. Think about it like this. The distinction is that courage is that which moves forward in the fear. There's a big difference. Think about Daniel and his three friends as they were being threatened with being thrown into the furnace. Now, no one will ever convince me that they weren't afraid. I mean, I'm just not convinced at all. But they said, what did they say? Okay, King, even if God does not save us from your fiery furnace, we are not going to bow down before that idol. That's courage. That's not fearlessness. How do I know that? Because they recognize they're going to be thrown into the furnace if they don't bow down. We as believers, you and I in this room, whether we're aware of it or not, I think we think about it, we can say it, but we're not aware of it, and I think that's God's mercy. There's a battle going on around us in the heavenlies about which we have no awareness whatsoever other than when we focus upon it like just now. But for the most part, we just move through our lives like everybody else. I think that's God's mercy. Think for a moment. If you and I could see the battle that's going on around us in the heavenlies all the time, I don't think we could conduct ourselves in any normative fashion for anything. Couldn't drive a car, couldn't talk to our friends, couldn't do a job. I don't think we could do anything except focus on this amazing battle that's going on around us 24/7. I don't think it would be possible for us to engage in normal activities at all. So it's God's mercy. And we live in a culture, in a time, where the whole of the world is aligned against the maker of the universe. The Bible says that. We, in our natural selves, are at war with God. And God is looking at you and me to be kind of like a tea kettle on the stove in a crowded room full of people that aren't paying any attention to the tea kettle. The tea kettle whistles, and it just keeps whistling. And whether the people in the room pay any attention or not, the intention of the tea kettle is to whistle, and that's us. We're to be those tea kettles whistling in this world that God is, and that all of us need to have a right relationship with him. So with all that in mind, now let's look at the text. I'll begin reading in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8. The king of Syria was at war with Israel. And the king of Syria consulted his advisors, who said, you should invade Israel at such and such a place. But the prophet Elisha sent this message to the king of Israel. Make sure that you don't pass through this place, because Syria is going to invade there. So the king of Israel sent a message to the place the prophet had specified and warned them to be on their guard for the Syrians. This happened on several occasions. This made the king of Syria upset, and I can understand why. So he summoned his advisors and said, somebody of us is helping the king of Israel. One of the advisors said, no, my master, O king. The prophet Elisha, who lives in Israel, keeps telling the king of Israel the things that you're saying in your bedroom. The king ordered, go and find out where he is so that I can send some men to capture him. So the king was told he lives in Dothan. So they sent horses and chariots, the Assyrians did there, along with a good-sized army. They arrived during the night and they surrounded the city. The prophet's attendant got up in the morning, who was probably Gehazi. When he went outside, there was an army surrounding the city, along with horses and chariots, and he said to Elisha, oh, my master, what are we going to do? Elisha replied to him and said, don't be afraid, for our side outnumbers their side. Elisha prayed and said, oh Lord, open Gehazi's eyes so that he can see. The Lord opened his eyes, and he saw that the hill was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the Syrian army approached Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike these people blind. The Lord struck them with blindness as Elisha had prayed. And then Elisha said to the army, this is not the right road, this is not the right city. Follow me, and I'll lead you to the man you're looking for. And so Elisha led them to Samaria. When they entered Samaria, Elisha said, Lord, open their eyes so that they then can see. The Lord opened their eyes, and they saw that they were in the middle of Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, should I strike them down, my master? Elisha replied, do not strike them down. You didn't capture them with your sword or your bow, so what gives you the right to strike them down? Give them food and give them water so that they can eat and drink and then go back to their master. So the king of Israel threw a great banquet for them. They ate and they drank. Then he sent the army of Syria back to their master. And after that, no Syrian raiding parties again invaded Israel. You know, when I read this text, I think to myself, I wonder if we ought to try some of that as a country in some of these places where we're in conflict with these nations. Feed them, water them, make them comfortable, send them back where they came from, if that wouldn't stop some of the conflicts that we have. I don't know, but it stopped it here. Now this king of Syria is Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad. He was a conquering king. He was not content to just remain within Syria's borders. He wanted to expand his territory. And back then, in that time of the history of the world, that was one of the ways to wealth. If you would conquer other nations, you would absorb their wealth. And so that was a common practice. Ben-Hadad worshipped Rimmon, which is a pagan deity. Now, if you go back one chapter, watch the button there. If you go back one chapter, you will read how the king of Syria was contacted by a slave girl through Naaman, the Syrian general, and Naaman found himself who was a leprous general, sent back to Israel, and he was healed. He was healed. Well, Naaman had a problem. He said, okay, if I appreciate being healed, obviously, he tried to bring Elisha upward of $50,000 to $60,000 worth of stuff to pay for the healing. And Elisha said, I don't want it. Elisha was a very different evangelist than most of those we have today, who would not turn down the $50,000 or $60,000 worth of goods and services that were being provided. However, when Naaman was healed, he said, look, I'm a convert now. I believe in the God that Elisha believes in. So here you've got a Jewish proselyte who's concerned over the fact that when he goes back to Syria, his king is going to go in the temple of Rimmon. When the king goes in the temple of Rimmon, Naaman's going to accompany him, and when the king bows down, he'll pull Naaman down too. And Naaman says, what should I do? And Elisha says, you just go in peace. In other words, God knows Naaman's heart. Naaman's bodily conditions, where Naaman is, what Naaman does for a living, those things are set aside because God knows Naaman's heart now belongs to him. And so he's content with that. And Ben-Hadad, what was happening was he was setting up ambushes at these various places around Kingdom of Israel, Samaria, and these ambushes, of course, would work, right? If you don't know that there's something coming, that's what made what Elisha was telling the king so important. I know where he's going to be next before he ever showed up. Well, I want to funnel that down to you and to me. One of the greatest tools, in my view, and this may not be your experience, it certainly is mine, that Satan has in order to attack you and me is an ambush. It's always when we're just minding our business, we're not doing anything of a necessarily spiritual nature, we're just doing what we do, and all of a sudden we find ourselves drawn into something sinful unexpectedly. Now, when we look at these texts, I'm just going to say what we're seeing in reading them, and in the way I even read it today as you read along, it's a very sanitized version of what was going on. Very sanitized. I mean, we don't enter into these stories in the way that these people who were living them were in them at all. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if it's possible for us. We sing the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. We love that hymn. I like that hymn. I like the feelings. Summer, winter, harvest, whatever, God's always there. He's looking out for us. I love that. But where does that hymn come from? Where does that phrase come from? Morning by morning, His mercies are new. It comes from Lamentations. That's right. What was happening when Jeremiah wrote that? He was in a hole. He was in a hole. And this wasn't a hole like we're thinking about. This was so deep that he couldn't climb out. It's muddy in the bottom. There's no food, no water, no nothing. He's just tossed in that hole and left there to die. Now, it's hard for us to relate to that. We can't relate to that as we think about great is thy faithfulness. But that's the picture. How in the world did Jeremiah pen those words in that hole? There's a battle 24/7 going on around us, and mercifully God has seen fit such that we just aren't really constantly aware of it. And you all know this to be true, that once you say yes, I say yes to Jesus, you say yes to Jesus, we become a target of the battle. We become the primary target, all of us. Think about Job. I love to read Job because of the teaching that's there. But again, it's sanitized, isn't it? It's very sanitized. I want us, as best as we can this morning, just if you can, think of it like this. Think of yourself. Think of your situation. Think of your family. Think of your cars. Think of your furniture. Think of your clothing. Think of everything you have that makes life really nice here. And then think about every bit of it being taken away just like that. Every bit of it. It's a cold day, right? If everything we have that protects us from the cold were stripped away, what would we do? I'd say we'd shiver. And that's about it. Okay? And then, poor Job, to top all that off, he's left there with nothing but his spouse and him. And a spouse who's saying, why don't you just curse God and die? Which is not bad advice when you're Job. And then he's covered with boils. His health gets withdrawn from him. I mean, how much further can it go? Do you think for 1 second, well, first I'll make it personal. Do you think for any of us for 1 second we'd be sitting there thinking, I'm a soldier in God's army? Wow, isn't that great? I'm a soldier in God's army. I know that wouldn't be the first thing that occurred to me as I'm sitting there with the piece of pottery scraping boils. I don't think Job thought that either. He was mercifully carried through this without any real awareness of why any of it was going on at all. At all. This is a peeve for me. It may not be a peeve for any of you, so don't take it like you need to absorb my peeve here. But when I go to a Christian bookstore and I find that 70% of the books are self-help of some kind or another, and what is the self-help based upon? A formula. This is what happened to me, and I did this, and God did this, and if you'll buy this book and take it home and do what I did, it'll work for you too. I'm just thinking, no, that's not the way it is at all. You know, God takes Carter and Jimmy and Brad and Becky and Nancy and me and all of us as individuals. He calls us out. He works with us. We're brought into places where God is going to grow us, and there's no formula to that at all. I mean, look at Naaman. Go dip in the Jordan River. He came to Elisha thinking he's going to wave his hands over me like a Harry Potter kind of thing, and he's going to be, all the leprosy's going to go away. And what does he say? Go dip in the river 7 times, the River Jordan, which was a muddy river. And he thought to himself, there are better rivers back in Syria, but this is the one I'm to dip in. God is really diverse in the way he works. He works with individuals. There was a reason he had Naaman go back and dip in the Jordan in that way. And that he didn't allow Elisha to walk. Elisha didn't even come out. He sent Gehazi out. Go tell him to dip in the River Jordan, which was an insult to Naaman. In the Semitic culture, the master of the house is supposed to greet guests. He didn't even do it himself. So I think about it in things of terms like we have this prayer list. We pray. We're praying for God to do things. There's no formula here. All we're doing is just asking how God might answer. I'll just say it for what I think it is. You know, we pray for this little congregation that God would use us, and look at what's just happened this week. 2 members of our congregation have suddenly been inspired to start a children's and youth work here. I didn't say anything to them. Maybe some of you did. I don't know. I think not. They just decided on their own. God prompted them to do it. And both of them have been intimately involved in finishing this building, just out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. Unexpected. So it is. So here we are. I think Elisha's servant here, Gehazi, was extremely fearful. I mean, you look at the text and what does he say? What are we going to do? He looks out there and he sees this gigantic army, the Syrians all around him. He's afraid. And I think you'd be foolish not to be afraid. He's not fearless. He's very afraid. And you and I walk around in this world without any clear awareness of this battle that's going on in the heavenlies around us. We don't have any awareness of it other than like right now when we're thinking about it. Rest of the time we're just minding our business. We can't see it. We're in corporeal bodies. We're trapped in time. None of these things that we can escape. And you know something? God knows all that about you and me. He knows all that. So this text that we have read here today is another one of those very sanitized texts. The Bible's just that way. We receive it that way. We're not able to enter into the terror that would have been Gehazi's thinking in that moment. He couldn't see the battle that was going on around him in the heavenlies. And so we become fearful, naturally so. But you know, that's why we're in here today. That's why we've got a Bible, is so that through that God can remind us that he is there. There is a battle, and the battle really belongs to him, not to us. He can intervene wherever he likes, in any way he likes. I'm going to call what just happened this week a definite intervention. I mean, one of the major things that we have faced as a congregation is a one-room schoolhouse with no place for children. And now there's going to be a place for children. I know that in past decades, this may be your experience to some degree. It certainly has been mine. There have been all kinds of publications, all kinds of teachings, all kinds of things to remind us about something called warfare prayer. Nothing wrong with that, but let me just hip you to something you may not be hipped to necessarily in your thinking. Anytime you and I start to speak with God about anything, we're in warfare right then and there. There is nothing more frightening to the demonic realm than a believer praying. Nothing. Nothing. Greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world. So look around the world today and see these things, many things on this list today, about which you and I can do absolutely, physically nothing. Nothing. Huge problems, scary things. Families being uprooted in warfare, famine, all kinds of things, people with diseases in our local community all around us that we can't do anything about. What could Gehazi do that day with the Syrian army that was gathered around Elisha's home in Dothan? Nothing, nothing but look out there and say, we're done. That tells me that there's a heavenly battle. And you and I, when we say to ourselves, or actually we say to ourselves, I'm going to go pray, and then we say to God, Lord, hear me. Just like Elijah did. You know, that's all he said when he got to the mountain, to Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal were gathered, and they danced for 9 hours that day and done everything possible to invoke Baal, who never showed up. I love one of the texts in there. It says, maybe he's in the toilet. That's literally what the text says. Maybe he's in the toilet. Maybe he just can't get done yet. And all Elijah said was, Lord, hear me. And the fire came. I'll tell you, there's a heavenly battle. You'll notice something in Ephesians. We love that text about the armor of God. Okay, and you go through the list of all the armor that we're to put on the whole armor of God. Hopefully we are. But you'll notice a couple things about it. One thing you'll notice is how Paul closes that little pericope. He then says, and pray. That's what he says. Put on the armor and then pray. And you'll notice something else too. There's no back armor. He doesn't tell us to wade in with swords a-swinging. He just says stand. Just stand. See, the battle's going to find us no matter what. If we belong to Jesus and we are praying, the battle will find us. Always. It will find us. And it's lifelong. The heavenly battle goes on 24/7, no matter what's happening in our lives. But Paul says so clearly, it's not flesh and blood we're battling against at all. And the weapons we've been given for that battle aren't carnal. So living in this world as a believer, in this fallen, messy, upholstered, air-conditioned cesspool that we call modern living, is hard. And I'm going to say, sometimes it's harder than the thought of actually leaving this world for God's sake. But he's not left us here to do it alone. Gehazi looked out there and saw something. I wonder how that affected Gehazi's life after that. To see that and realize how God actually is working. Hard to say. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about what you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll